Tonight we're settling in to think about one of the boldest plans humanity has ever dreamed up for reaching another star. We're talking about generation ships, enormous vessels built to carry thousands of people on voyages that stretch across centuries, where everyone who boards at the very beginning will quietly live out their whole life without ever seeing where the ship is headed. Only their far-off descendants, many generations later, will actually arrive. On the surface, it sounds like the grandest adventure imaginable. And yet quietly, the truth underneath it is far heavier than most people expect. By the time we reach the end of tonight's journey together, you'll understand why a slow generation ship might be humanity's only real path to the stars. And why choosing that path opens up questions we are, frankly, nowhere near ready to answer. Before we drift into it, if you find comfort in exploring the universe the way we do here, a quiet like or subscribe helps this little channel find its way to more curious minds like yours. It costs nothing, and it means a lot. Now let's settle in. Picture this. You were born aboard a spaceship, not some sleek film prop, but a colossal structure, miles from end to end, turning slowly through space to create a gentle imitation of gravity. This ship is the only world you have ever known. You have never laid eyes on Earth, and you never will. 70 years before you were born, your grandparents walked aboard this vessel and left behind everything familiar, setting off toward a star system so far away that the ship itself won't arrive for another 400 years. You will spend your entire life here. Your children will spend their entire lives here too. Perhaps, if fortune allows, your great-great-great-great-grandchildren will finally look out and see the destination. But you won't. Your whole existence unfolds in the emptiness between stars, in a stretch of space so vast and so unforgiving that a single mishap, one failed system, could end every life aboard in an instant. This is the quiet reality behind generation ships. And it's exactly what we need to sit with tonight. Let's begin with why anyone would consider this approach in the first place. The trouble is simple. Really, space is almost incomprehensibly large. Our closest stellar neighbor, Proxima Centauri, sits about 4.2 light-years away, which works out to roughly 25 trillion miles of empty distance. Our fastest spacecraft leaving the solar system moves at around 36,000 miles per hour. And at that pace, the trip to Proxima Centauri would take nearly 80,000 years longer, in fact, than the whole of recorded human history. Clearly, we would need something dramatically faster. Over the years, scientists have floated a handful of theoretical propulsion ideas. There's nuclear pulse propulsion, in which a ship essentially rides the shockwaves from small nuclear detonations set off behind it. There are fusion rockets, harnessing the same reaction that powers the sun itself. There's the possibility of antimatter engines, which could in theory push a craft to a meaningful fraction of light speed. And there are light sails, nudged along by the pressure of powerful lasers. Each of these, at least on paper, could shorten the journey considerably. Some proposals imagine reaching around 10% of the speed of light, which would get a ship to Proxima Centauri in about 42 years. That sounds almost reasonable, until you sit with what 10% of light speed actually means in practice. At that velocity, about 18,600 meters per second, striking something as small as a grain of sand would unleash energy comparable to several sticks of dynamite. Something the size of a pebble would be devastating. And space, quietly, isn't as empty as it looks. It's threaded through with dust, scattered particles, the occasional stray rock. At extreme speeds, even the thinnest wisps of interstellar material turn into something like a sandblaster capable of tearing a spacecraft apart. You'd need shielding several feet thick just to survive the trip, and all of that shielding adds weight. The energy demands, too, become almost absurd. Pushing just 1 kilogram to 10% of light speed takes roughly 450 trillion joules. Now multiply that by the mass of a ship large enough to carry a real, viable population, thousands of people, along with everything they'd need to survive, and you arrive at energy requirements that outstrip our entire planet's power output combined. We simply don't have a realistic way today to generate or store energy on anything close to that scale for propulsion. So we're left with something slower, perhaps 1% of light speed, maybe 2 if we're feeling hopeful. At 1%, about 6.7 million miles per hour, a trip to Proxima Centauri stretches past 400 years. And if we're aiming for a more promising system, one that might actually hold a habitable world, we could be looking at 500 years, 1,000, even 2,000. No single human life spans that. No single generation does either. You would need many generations in sequence. Which means you're no longer just designing a vehicle, you're designing an entire self-contained world, one capable of sustaining human life for centuries without a single supply run from home. And that's where things get genuinely complicated. Because building something that can cross interstellar distances is one engineering problem. Keeping people alive, sane and healthy inside it for 1,000 years is an entirely different one. Let's turn to the ship itself for a moment. The first thing worth understanding is just how much scale this requires. You couldn't send a dozen people on a mission like this. You'd need enough genetic variety to avoid the dangers of inbreeding. Enough people that a handful of random deaths wouldn't threaten everything, and enough overlap in skills and knowledge to weather losses. Most serious proposals suggest a starting population somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people, though some studies push that number into the thousands. That means the ship needs more than just quarters to sleep in. It needs farmland, water recycling, power generation, workshops for building and repairing things, medical facilities, schools. Essentially, everything a small town would need to function. Except this town is drifting through interstellar space with absolutely no chance of a supply delivery. The ship itself would have to be enormous. We're talking about structures miles long. One design concept, the O'Neill cylinder, imagines rotating habitats several miles in length and roughly half a mile across, spinning to generate gravity through centrifugal force. Another, the Stanford Torus, imagines a giant ring turning around a central hub. Either way, the engineering hurdles are immense. You'd need materials tough enough to endure the constant stress of rotation without tearing. You'd need power systems capable of running for centuries with little upkeep. Nuclear fission reactors might last decades, but eventually the fuel runs dry. Fusion reactors, if we ever master them, could run far longer. Some designs lean on solar panels, but once you're far enough from any star, sunlight becomes essentially useless, leaving you dependent on stored energy or nuclear fuel for the entire trip. Everything on board would need to sustain itself completely. Every drop of water recycled, every breath of oxygen recaptured and reused, food grown through hydroponics or similar closed-loop systems, waste broken down and turned back into something usable, and any failure anywhere in these cycles could turn catastrophic quickly. Picture the water recycling system breaking down without a fast fix. People begin dying of thirst within days. The same holds true for oxygen, for food, for temperature regulation. Every single system becomes a single point of failure for the whole mission, which means you need backups. Multiple redundant systems for everything critical. But redundancy means more mass, and more mass means more energy to move it, and more fuel to carry along the way. There's a harsh balancing act here between staying safe and staying feasible. Then there's the matter of shielding. Interstellar space is soaked in radiation, cosmic rays, and high-energy particles capable of slicing straight through solid matter. Without Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere standing guard, that radiation slowly chips away at your DNA, raising cancer risk, causing neurological damage, shortening how long you live. You'd need thick layers of shielding water, polyethylene, or similar materials able to absorb it. That too adds mass. Some designs cleverly propose using the ship's own water supply as a shield, wrapping living quarters in tanks that do double duty. Clever, yes, but it's still more weight, more complexity to manage. Micrometeorite strikes are another quiet threat. Space may be mostly emptiness, but across centuries of travel, the odds of a collision climb steadily. Even a tiny rock, moving fast enough relative to the ship, could punch straight through the hull. You'd need layered shielding, self-sealing materials, and careful compartmentalizing so that one breach doesn't vent the entire vessel. And on top of all that, constant maintenance because ships wear down. Metal fatigues, seals crack, electronics fail over time. You'd need a crew capable of repairing or replacing virtually every part of the ship, which means onboard manufacturing, 3D printers, machine shops, stockpiles of raw material. Anything that might break has to be something you can fabricate yourself, because there's no calling for help, no ordering replacement parts. You are entirely, completely on your own. This level of independence has never once been achieved by humanity. The International Space Station, for comparison, has been continuously inhabited for over 20 years, and it still depends on regular resupply missions from Earth. It has never been self-sufficient. A generation ship would need to sustain itself for at least 20 times that duration, with no outside help whatsoever. And yet, as daunting as all these engineering puzzles are, they pale in comparison to the human ones. Because the hardest part of building a generation ship was never really the ship. It's the people who live inside it. So let's think quietly about what daily life would actually feel like aboard one of these ships. You're born inside it. Your entire world is bounded by metal walls, artificial light, air that's been breathed 1,000 times before. Perhaps you've seen old images of Earth stored away in the ship's archives, blue skies, green forests, wide oceans, but you've never felt any of it firsthand, and you never will. Above you, There's no true sky, only a ceiling. Beneath you, the ground curves gently upward in the distance if you happen to live inside a rotating cylinder, and the horizon simply looks wrong. Everything feels enclosed, because everything genuinely is enclosed. This is the whole of your existence. You'll spend 70 years here, perhaps 80 or 90 if you're fortunate, and then you'll be gone. And your children will step into your place. Their children will follow. And so the pattern continues, generation after generation. Most of the people who live and pass away aboard the ship will never glimpse the destination. They'll be born mid-journey, live out their years mid-journey, and pass mid-journey, an entire life spent moving towards somewhere they'll never actually reach. How do you keep spirits up under those conditions? How do you give someone a sense of purpose when their whole life is just one link in a chain stretching across centuries? This is the psychological weight of generation ships, and it is enormous. Research into isolated human communities' Antarctic outposts, submarine crews consistently shows that confinement wears people down. Depression climbs, conflicts flare up, relationships strain under the pressure. And that's with people who know, deep down, that the isolation will eventually end. Aboard a generation ship, there's no such comfort. Not for you, not for your children, quite possibly not even for your grandchildren. You're essentially asking people to accept a life bound by walls, in service of descendants they will never meet. That is an enormous thing to ask of anyone. Naturally, not everyone will accept it gracefully. Some will grow bitter. They might sabotage the mission, whether on purpose or through simple carelessness. Some might refuse to have children altogether, breaking the chain the whole mission depends on. Others might splinter into factions, each with a different vision for what the journey should mean, and those factions could easily clash. You'd need social structures sturdy enough to hold everything together across centuries, governments flexible enough to bend with changing times, yet stable enough to avoid collapsing into chaos. You'd need education systems capable of passing essential knowledge down cleanly, generation after generation, without anything vital slipping through the cracks. You'd need cultural rituals that give people something to hold on to, some sense of meaning. And every piece of this would need to function, more or less flawlessly, for hundreds of years. Because if the social fabric tears, if conflict turns violent, if crucial knowledge is lost along the way, the mission doesn't just falter. It ends. Everyone aboard is gone. Let's think about leadership for a moment. Who actually runs a generation ship? The original crew that departs Earth will carry some kind of command structure with them, a captain, officers, specialists trained for the task. But within a few decades, all of those people will be gone. Their children inherit the responsibility. Then their children's children. Over time, whatever structure they started with will shift and evolve. Will it stay democratic? Could it slide into something authoritarian? Might it fracture into rival centers of power? There's no historical precedent to draw from here. Humanity has never built a fully sealed, self-contained society traveling through the void for centuries on end. The closest comparisons we have are isolated island nations, and history offers a mixed lesson. Isolation can breed stagnation, cultural drift, sometimes outright collapse. Polynesian voyagers once crossed thousands of miles of open ocean to settle remote islands, an extraordinary feat of navigation, and yet some of those same societies, once settled, eventually lost the very navigational knowledge that got them there. Easter Island's population famously crumbled after depleting its limited resources. These aren't just historical footnotes, they're warnings. Isolated societies can fail. They can lose knowledge that once seemed unforgettable. They can make choices that quietly doom the generations that follow. A generation ship is isolation taken to its furthest extreme. One poor decision, one forgotten skill, one crack in the social order, and the whole mission could unravel. There's no rescue coming. You are entirely on your own. Think, too, about succession. Here on Earth, when a leader steps down or passes away, there's usually an established process: elections, appointments, institutions built to outlast any single lifetime. But a generation ship starts with nothing like that. The very first generation has to invent the system from scratch. Maybe they land on a democratic council. Maybe something closer to naval command. Maybe some blend of the two. Whatever they choose becomes the blueprint everyone after them inherits, but blueprints don't always hold up once reality starts pressing against them. The second generation, having inherited a system they never actually designed, might find it wanting and push for change. If that system is flexible enough to bend peacefully, reform might happen smoothly. But if it's rigid, resistant to adjustment, pressure quietly builds. Frustration grows. And eventually that pressure can erupt a power struggle, a coup, outright violence. In a confined space with limited resources, violence becomes especially dangerous. There's no room to retreat, no neutral ground to fall back to. Everyone is forced into constant proximity with whoever they're at odds with, which is exactly the kind of situation that lets small conflicts spiral out of control. A dispute that might have simply dissipated on a planet where people can put distance between themselves becomes something far more consuming aboard a ship. There's also the tension between expertise and democracy. Keeping a generation ship running takes real technical skill: engineering, medicine, agriculture, the intricacies of life support. These aren't things everyone naturally knows how to do. They take years of training. So do you hand control to the people who understand the machinery? Build something like a technocracy where those who know the systems best make the decisions? On paper, that's efficient. The people who understand how things work should probably be the ones managing them. But it also creates a class divide: the technically skilled versus everyone else, and that divide can breed real resentment. People don't love being told what to do by an elite, even a well-qualified one. History is full of populist uprisings against expert-led governance because people crave agency. Even when the experts genuinely make better calls, most people still want to feel some control over their own lives. Aboard a generation ship, striking a balance between technical competence and democratic participation becomes essential. You need engineers keeping the lights on, yes, but you also need the wider population to feel like they matter, like they have a stake in how things turn out. Because if people feel shut out of decision-making, they disengage. They stop caring whether the mission succeeds. They might even quietly work against it, not out of malice necessarily, but out of simple indifference. If the mission doesn't seem to serve you, why would you serve it? And that attitude, spread across dozens or hundreds of people confined together for a lifetime, causes tasks to slip, maintenance to lag, systems to wear down faster than they should. Problems pile up, and slowly the mission spirals toward failure. So governance here isn't just a question of who's in charge, it's about maintaining a sense of belonging, making sure every single person feels like their contribution genuinely counts. That's an incredibly difficult thing to sustain across generations, especially once you reach people who were simply born into the mission rather than choosing it. They may never feel the same depth of commitment the original crew carried with them. And if enough people drift into that mindset, the whole social fabric starts to fray. Then there's the challenge of dissent. Here on Earth, disagreeing with your government still leaves you options. You can protest, vote differently, or in extreme situations, simply leave for somewhere else. Aboard a generation ship, none of that applies. There's nowhere to go. If you disagree with leadership, your choices shrink down to voicing your concerns and hoping someone listens, or quietly organizing others who feel the same. But if leadership won't listen, if dissent gets brushed aside or actively suppressed, what happens next? You can't walk away. You can't opt out. You're stuck. And that's a recipe for a slow-building pressure cooker. Suppressed frustration doesn't vanish, it festers, grows, and eventually finds a way out. Sometimes as open rebellion. If the uprising succeeds, a new government forms, but the transition itself tends to be violent and chaotic. People get hurt. Systems can be damaged in the fighting, and there's no guarantee the new leadership will actually improve anything. Revolutions don't always make things better, sometimes they just trade one flawed system for another. And if the rebellion fails instead, the fallout is often just as harsh. Leadership cracks down harder. Dissidents face punishment or imprisonment. Fear spreads through the population, people grow quiet, and the whole society tips towards something oppressive. Oppressive systems, in turn, are fragile. They depend on fear to hold together. And fear breeds resentment. And resentment has a way of reigniting the very conflict it was meant to suppress. The cycle just continues. A far healthier path would be building governance that welcomes dissent from the start, that allows for peaceful reform, that makes space for many different voices. But that kind of system takes real wisdom, foresight, and a genuine willingness to share power qualities not every leader happens to have. And even if the first generation manages to build something fair and responsive, there's no guarantee it survives intact. Power has a way of corrupting. People in charge tend to want to stay in charge. They might quietly rewrite the rules in their own favor, or suppress opposition to hold on to their position. Across centuries, even a thoughtfully designed system can slowly decay into something oppressive and dysfunctional, and once that happens, undoing it is never easy. Let's turn gently to the question of belief. Human beings need a sense of meaning. We need to feel that our lives matter, that what we do carries some purpose. Here on Earth, people find that meaning in countless ways: careers, families, communities, faith, personal growth. Aboard a generation ship, many of those wells run shallow. Career choices are shaped entirely by what the ship needs, not by personal passion you train for whatever role the mission requires. Family life still matters, of course, but its shape is dictated by population targets. You might be encouraged or actively discouraged from having children depending on demographic needs at the time. Community shrinks down to a few thousand people, with no possibility of ever meeting someone new, no fresh perspective from beyond the walls. You're bound to the same faces for your entire life. And personal growth, too, runs up against the ship's limited resources and narrow opportunities. So where does meaning come from in a life shaped like that? Often religion fills the gap, a belief in something larger than yourself, some divine purpose, perhaps an afterlife where sacrifice is finally rewarded. For people living confined, demanding lives, faith can offer real comfort. It can make hardship bearable, give people a reason to keep going. But faith can also divide. Suppose the ship launches with a population holding many different beliefs. At first there might be tolerance, even genuine respect across faiths. But across generations, tension can quietly build. Religious communities might compete for influence, attempt to win converts, or grow suspicious of one another's beliefs. In a space this confined, religious conflict can be devastating. It can fracture the population into hostile camps, and history is filled with wars fought over exactly this. Aboard a generation ship, that kind of rupture could unravel the entire mission. On the other hand, shared belief can also be a powerful unifier. If everyone aboard holds the same faith, it can knit together a strong sense of community, shared rituals, shared values, a shared sense of purpose. Religion, in that light, becomes the glue holding a society together across the centuries. Some proposals for generation ships actually suggest launching with a population that shares one faith from the outset, specifically to sidestep the risk of religious conflict. But that solution creates its own problems. Uniform belief can slide into rigidity. When everyone believes the same thing, disagreement starts to look like heresy, and those who question the faith may face punishment. The whole society becomes less tolerant, and intolerant societies tend to be brittle. They struggle to adapt when new information or shifting circumstances demand it. They cling to doctrine even when it works against them, and that stubbornness could genuinely endanger the mission. What happens if religious teaching aboard the ship clashes with something the mission needs to survive? Suppose genetic engineering is considered sinful by the prevailing faith, yet it's necessary to keep the population healthy. Suppose religious leaders accumulate real power and start placing faith above technical judgment. None of this is far-fetched. History shows plenty of cases where religious conviction overrode rational decision-making, where people turned down medical treatment or practical solutions because they conflicted with belief. Aboard a generation ship, that kind of refusal could prove fatal. If belief prevents people from maintaining the ship, from adapting to new problems, from making hard but necessary calls, the mission doesn't survive. Balancing the emotional comfort that faith provides against the practical need for evidence-based decisions is yet another delicate challenge. People need hope, need meaning, but they also need to accept reality as it is. Holding that balance steady across centuries while belief itself shifts and evolves is remarkably difficult. New spiritual movements might rise, existing faiths might split. Each generation carries the possibility of religious upheaval, and each upheaval threatens the social unity the mission depends on to survive. Now let's talk about something even more delicate: reproduction. You need people having children, enough to replace those who pass and keep the population steady, but not so many that resources buckle under the strain. A generation ship simply cannot support a population boom. Food production has hard limits, water recycling has hard limits, living space doesn't expand, population growth has to be actively managed. But how do you manage it ethically? Do you cap births, allowing each couple only 1 or 2 children? Do you require permits, with some governing body deciding who's allowed to have a child at all? Do you screen for genetic conditions, restricting reproduction for certain people to protect the wider gene pool? These are uncomfortable questions. They touch on reproductive freedom, personal autonomy, even the shadow of eugenics. But aboard a generation ship, they can't be avoided. Resources are finite. Every additional person draws on food, water, oxygen, life support. If population outpaces what the ship can sustain, everyone suffers starvation, conflict over dwindling resources, systems pushed past their limits. Population has to be controlled somehow. The harder question is who decides, and how those decisions get enforced without tearing the community apart. Imagine being told you can't have a second child simply because the ship has reached capacity. You want that child, you love being a parent, you're capable of caring for another. And still, the answer is no, the community's needs outweigh your own. That's an incredibly bitter thing to accept. Some people will make peace with it, understanding the necessity. Others will resist, feeling robbed of something they consider fundamental: the right to build a family, to shape their own future. Some might break the rules entirely and have children without authorization. And then what? Do you punish the parents? Punish a child who never had any say in the matter? Force terminations? Sterilizations? These are genuinely dark corners of the discussion, exactly the kind of decisions capable of splitting a society apart. And yet, without some form of population control, the ship simply cannot function. Too many people and life support capacity is exceeded, air grows thin, food runs short, water rationing turns severe, people suffer, children go hungry, the social contract frays, and everyone ends up fighting for survival. In that chaos, the mission dies. So, however ethically uncomfortable it is, population control becomes necessary. The real question is how to carry it out in a way that limits harm and keeps the community intact. One proposal involves a lottery each year. A set number of birth permits become available, couples enter, and winners are simply granted permission to try for a child, with losers waiting until the following year. There's a certain fairness in randomness. Nobody is singled out based on who they are. But that same randomness means some people who desperately want a family might wait years, even decades, for their turn, while others who feel ambivalent about parenthood might win on the very first attempt. That feels unfair in its own way. An alternative approach leans on merit-granting birth permits to couples who demonstrate responsibility, good health, valuable skills, genetic diversity. This optimizes for the mission's long-term success, effectively selecting for the strongest possible next generation. But it also means making value judgments about who deserves to have children. Who decides what deserving even means? What criteria intelligence, physical fitness, psychological stability, contribution to the ship? Any criteria chosen will be subjective, vulnerable to bias, and enforcing such a system breeds deep resentment among those judged unworthy. Being told you're not good enough to have a child is devastating. It can curdle into anger, alienation, even a desire for revenge in some. Feeling the mission has no regard for them, might choose to work against it out of pure spite. There's also the matter of genetic diversity itself. With only a few thousand people aboard, the available genetic variation is limited, and over time, inbreeding becomes a genuine risk. Reproduction has to be carefully managed just to preserve genetic health. Some proposals suggest carrying frozen embryos or other genetic material along, letting later generations introduce fresh diversity when needed. But that adds its own complications. You'd need technology capable of preserving genetic material for centuries, medical expertise to use it properly, and a population willing to accept the practice socially. What if people come to resent children born from genetic material brought along from Earth, viewing them as outsiders rather than true members of the ship's community? That alone could fracture social cohesion. And then there's the emotional weight of reproductive limits. Humans carry a deep biological drive to have children. It's woven into who we are as a species. Restricting that, denying it outright to some, cuts directly against that instinct, and it creates real grief, real frustration, a genuine sense of loss. Some people cope by finding fulfillment elsewhere, career, relationships, other pursuits. But others won't. Their lives may feel incomplete without children of their own, and that kind of quiet despair has a way of spreading, poisoning the broader mood aboard the ship. Depression becomes common. Morale sinks. People stop caring about the mission at all. What's the point if you can't even have the family you want? This is exactly why reproductive policy aboard a generation ship carries such enormous weight. It's never just about numbers on a chart. It's about whether people feel their lives still hold purpose and fulfillment. Get it wrong, and the social cohesion the mission depends on begins to dissolve. Get it right, and you give people a genuine reason to care about the future, to invest in generations yet to come. Even generations that won't share their own bloodline. Let's spend some time on education, because it matters more than it might first seem. Every generation aboard needs to master the skills required to keep the ship running: engineering, agriculture, medicine, computing, physics, biology. The sheer volume of knowledge required to sustain a generation ship is staggering, and every bit of it has to pass down cleanly, generation after generation, without gaps. You simply can't afford to lose anything critical. If the generation that understands how to repair the fusion reactor fails to pass that knowledge to their children, and something later goes wrong with the reactor, the consequences could be fatal for everyone aboard. That means building in redundancy multiple people, trained in every essential skill, written manuals, video tutorials, interactive training systems. But even with all of that redundancy, knowledge can still slip away. Languages shift over time. Technical vocabulary drifts. What if 500 years in, the language spoken aboard has drifted so far from its origins that people can barely make sense of the old manuals? What if cultural attitudes shift and certain skills come to be seen as outdated or unnecessary? These aren't hypothetical worries. We've watched knowledge vanish throughout human history plenty of times already. The Library of Alexandria burned. The formula for Roman concrete was lost for well over 1,000 years. Entire civilizations have risen, fallen, and taken much of their accumulated knowledge with them into obscurity. A generation ship can't afford that kind of loss. Every scrap of knowledge is precious. Every skill matters. Losing even one could put the whole mission at risk. Which means education can't simply be passive. You can't just hand someone a textbook and hope the learning sticks. You need engaged, hands-on teaching apprenticeships where experienced hands work directly alongside students. Knowledge needs to be deeply internalized, not just memorized, but genuinely understood. Students need to grasp not only what procedures to follow, but why those procedures actually work. Because when something breaks in an unexpected way, you need people capable of thinking on their feet, diagnosing the problem, improvising a fix. Someone who's only ever memorized a checklist will be helpless the moment reality strays outside it. But teaching people to think critically, rather than just follow instructions, is genuinely difficult, and it requires skilled teachers who themselves need training. You'd need an entire educational infrastructure, schools, curricula, methods of assessment, and that whole infrastructure has to be maintained across generations, with each cohort of teachers training the next. Any small erosion in quality, any quiet loss of teaching skill, compounds year over year. 500 years down the line, the education system might be a faded echo of what it once was. Students might learn less effectively. Vital skills might be taught poorly or not taught at all, and the ship suffers as a result. There's also the deeper question of what to teach beyond pure technical necessity. Do you make room for history, art, philosophy, literature? None of that directly keeps the ship's systems running, but it's part of what makes us who we are. It gives life texture and depth. Without it, existence aboard becomes purely functional. You exist to work, to keep systems humming. Nothing more. That's a bleak way to live, and also a fragile one. People need more than mere survival. We need beauty, culture, something to stir the mind. Without that, morale collapses. People grow depressed, indifferent, disengaged. So cultural education has to be preserved, but it competes directly with technical training for the same limited hours and resources. Time spent studying literature is time not spent learning engineering, and in the short term at least, the mission may need engineers more urgently than poets. So there's real tension here. How do you balance what people need to survive against what they need to actually want to keep surviving? Different ships, presumably, would answer this differently, some leaning hard into technical training and accepting a thinner cultural life, others striving for balance and risking slightly weaker technical skills. There's no perfect formula. Only trade-offs, and those trade-offs ripple outward across centuries. Motivation is another quiet challenge tucked inside education. Here on Earth, students are typically driven by future opportunity, study hard, earn a place at a good school, build a career. Aboard a generation ship, career paths are far more constrained. You train for whatever the ship happens to need. Maybe your dream is to teach, but the ship urgently needs more agricultural technicians, so that's what you become. Personal desire takes a back seat to collective necessity, and that can be deeply demotivating. Why work hard if your future is already decided? Why strive for excellence if there's no clear reward for it? Some people are naturally self-motivated. They love learning purely for its own sake and take quiet pride in doing good work regardless of recognition. But most people need something external pushing them forward, and aboard a ship, the usual incentives simply don't apply. There's no social ladder to climb, no economic reward waiting at the top. Your role is largely fixed by what the mission assigns you. So new motivators have to be invented: public recognition for excellence perhaps, or better living quarters, or access to some scarce comfort. Or simply the quiet knowledge that your work genuinely matters, that the mission depends on you specifically. For some, that sense of purpose is more than enough. For others, it isn't, and without something more tangible, they disengage, doing only the bare minimum, no more. And minimum effort, spread across an entire society, leads to slow decline. Systems aren't maintained as carefully, innovation stalls, problems quietly accumulate, and the ship itself starts to deteriorate. Keeping people motivated, everyone, not just the students, takes constant, deliberate effort, recognition systems, cultural traditions that celebrate contribution, shared stories that reinforce why the mission matters. None of it happens automatically, and if it's neglected even briefly, motivation can collapse. Let's think too about recreation. What people actually do for enjoyment aboard a ship like this. Here on Earth, our options feel endless. Travel, sports, films, concerts, dining out, hiking, gaming, aboard a ship, options shrink dramatically. There's no travel beyond the vessel's own walls, no new places to discover, no distant destinations to visit. You'll see the same corridors, the same rooms, the same faces, day after day, for decades. That kind of sameness wears on people. Humans crave novelty, and boredom, left unchecked, breeds dissatisfaction, restlessness, even depression. So recreation and entertainment have to be built in deliberately, ways for people to unwind and genuinely enjoy themselves. Virtual reality could help fill some of that void. Simulated forests, beaches, cities, letting people wander through spaces they'll never physically visit. It isn't the same as the real thing, of course, but it's certainly better than nothing. The technology already exists today in a convincing form, and by the time humanity is actually building generation ships, it will likely be far more advanced. Entire simulated worlds, adventures, the sense of being somewhere entirely different. But virtual reality has its limits too. It remains, at its core, artificial. You can't smell the sea air or feel real wind or taste actual food inside it. It's a pale echo of the genuine article. And spending too much time inside it might cause its own psychological strain, a blurring between real and virtual, a creeping preference for the simulated world over the actual one. If people begin retreating into virtual spaces and avoiding real human interaction, social bonds start to weaken, and that's genuinely dangerous. Because the mission depends entirely on people cooperating, communicating, trusting one another in the physical world. If everyone withdraws into their own private simulation, that cooperation quietly erodes. So virtual reality would need careful management as supplement to real-world recreation, never a replacement for it. Other outlets might include sports, perhaps low-gravity variations in areas with reduced artificial gravity, or traditional games adapted to fit the ship's constraints. Sports offer real value, physical activity, social bonding, healthy competition, teamwork. But space aboard the ship is tight. There's no room for a full-sized football field or basketball court, so you might see smaller, scaled-down courts or entirely new games invented specifically to fit the ship's limitations. Art and music matter just as much. People need outlets to create, paint, sculpt, compose, perform, ways to process emotion, and add beauty to their surroundings. Music especially has a way of drawing people together. Concerts, communal singing, dance, these shared experiences build genuine community, reminding people that they belong to something larger, something built on common experience and shared values. But art and music, too, require resources, materials for painting or sculpture, instruments, space to perform, all of which competes with other needs. Do you dedicate precious cargo space to musical instruments or to spare parts for life support? Once again, it's survival weighed against quality of life. You need both. Survival without any richness to life is merely existing. But richness without survival is meaningless, because there's no one left to enjoy it. Striking that balance is essential, and it will be argued over constantly different generations valuing different things, and what one generation considers essential, the next might dismiss as wasteful indulgence. That shift in priorities across generations can spark real conflict. And underneath all of this sits a deeper psychological weight, the knowledge that you are part of a journey you will never personally see completed. Imagine being told from birth that your entire purpose is to keep the ship functioning, so that people you will never meet, your own distant descendants, might one day reach a star none of you will ever lay eyes on. Some people find real meaning in that. They take pride in their role, understanding that the mission depends on them personally, that without their quiet contribution, everything falls apart. Others, though, will resent it deeply. They'll feel trapped, born into a mission they never agreed to, forced to spend their whole life working toward a goal they'll never actually witness. Some might rebel outright, arguing the ship should turn back or aim for a nearer destination, or abandon the journey entirely in favor of settling some passing asteroid or rogue planet instead. These tensions are essentially unavoidable. Different generations will hold different priorities. The generation that left Earth chose this journey freely. Their descendants never did. That choice was made for them long before they were born. So how do you sustain commitment to a mission across centuries when most of the people living it never actually chose to be part of it in the first place? You need cultural rituals and shared stories that continually reconnect each new generation to the larger purpose, that make the journey itself feel meaningful, not just some distant destination decades or centuries away. But even with the most careful cultural design imaginable, some people will still push back, still want out, and there's simply nowhere for them to go. You're aboard for life. Now let's turn, gently, to what happens when things go wrong, because aboard a generation ship, sooner or later, something always will. Systems fail. People make mistakes. Accidents happen. Picture a hull breach, a micrometeorite strike, a structural failure, perhaps even sabotage. Suddenly, part of the ship is exposed straight to vacuum. Everyone inside that section has mere seconds to escape before the air is gone entirely. Bulkheads seal automatically to contain the damage, but if anyone is still trapped inside when they close, they're gone within minutes. Maybe it's 10 people lost. Maybe 50. Aboard a ship carrying only 1,000 or so, losing 50 people is nothing short of catastrophic. 5% of the total population gone in an instant, 5% of the genetic diversity, 5% of the skilled workforce. Whole families could be wiped out together. Critical knowledge might vanish if the wrong people happen to be among the lost. And the psychological toll on everyone who survives would be immense grief, trauma, fear, rippling through the community. People would want answers. Was it preventable? Is the ship even safe anymore? Morale would plummet, trust in leadership would erode, and some might demand the mission simply be called off. But there's nowhere to call it off to. You can't turn the ship around. Even if you somehow could, Earth is centuries behind you. You're committed. The only option is to keep going. Or picture a disease outbreak, instead some pathogen that lay dormant or mutated somewhere along the journey. In a closed environment with a small population, illness can spread with frightening speed. You'd have medical facilities aboard, certainly, but they're modest, nowhere near the resources of a full planetary civilization. You can't manufacture complex pharmaceuticals from scratch. You have whatever you brought with you, plus whatever can be synthesized using onboard equipment. If the illness turns out to be something your medicine simply can't treat, people start passing 10, then 20, then 100, and the population thins out. Panic typically spreads faster than the disease itself. People isolate themselves, refuse to cooperate, hoard whatever resources they can grab. Social cohesion begins to crack, and if the disease claims enough lives, critical expertise is lost along with them. The engineer who understood the water recycling system, gone. The doctor who knew how to treat radiation sickness, gone. The teacher training the next generation of technicians, gone. Knowledge disappears. The ship's ability to function deteriorates further, and more systems begin failing simply because no one left knows how to repair them. A downward spiral begins, and there's no outside help to interrupt it. You either recover on your own, or you don't. Consider, too, a straightforward breakdown in social order. Perhaps conflict erupts over resources, better living quarters, unfair rationing. Perhaps it's ideological, rival factions with competing visions for the mission's future. Perhaps it's something as small as a personal feud between families that slowly escalates over years. Tension rises. Eventually, violence breaks out in a space with nowhere to retreat to. That's an especially dangerous combination. You can't simply leave, can't put distance between hostile groups. Everyone remains trapped together. Fighting could damage critical systems. A fire in an enclosed environment is deadly. Even improvised weapons could breach the hull. And once violence takes hold, it's remarkably hard to stop. Feuds can perpetuate across generations, with children raised to resent the descendants of their parents' old enemies. The ship itself risks becoming a kind of war zone, resources diverted from upkeep toward conflict, systems degrading. The ship slowly falling apart until, eventually, everyone aboard is gone. This isn't idle speculation, either. History has shown us more than once how isolated groups under extreme stress can spiral into violence. The Donner Party, trapped by winter in the Sierra Nevada, resorted to cannibalism to survive. The mutineers who settled Pitcairn Island descended into murder and disorder within just a few years. These are extreme cases, certainly, but they illustrate exactly how dangerous isolation and sustained stress can become. A generation ship would exist under near constant pressure, limited resources, permanent confinement, the quiet awareness that a single mistake could kill everyone aboard. That's a genuine pressure cooker, and people under that kind of strain don't always behave rationally. You'd need real conflict resolution systems, strong social norms against violence, effective law enforcement that stops short of becoming oppressive, and a justice system people can genuinely trust. But building and maintaining all of that across centuries, in a culture slowly drifting away from its Earth-based origins, is an enormously difficult task. Cultures shift. Values change. What one generation holds essential, the next may view as hopelessly outdated. Someone born 200 years into the journey will have no direct connection to Earth whatsoever, only stories, old recordings, an idea of a place that feels, to them, no less alien than any unexplored planet. Their sense of identity will be tied entirely to the ship, not to humanity's original home. They might build an entirely different culture, with entirely different values and priorities, and that culture might not place the same value on the mission's original goal at all. They might decide the destination isn't worth the sacrifice, choose to settle somewhere else instead, or simply keep drifting indefinitely. This is what's known as mission drift, a slow, generational shift in purpose and priority, and it's a very real risk for any ship like this. How do you keep people committed to a goal chosen by ancestors they never knew, for the benefit of descendants they'll never meet? Let's dig a little deeper into the technological challenges that would compound quietly over time. When the ship first launches, every system is brand new. Everything functions exactly as designed. Redundancies sit ready, spare parts are stocked and waiting. But decades pass, and things inevitably shift. Metal fatigues under constant strain, radiation exposure wears materials down, electronic components fail, seals crack, bearings wear thin. Every mechanical system has a natural lifespan, and aboard a generation ship, you can't simply order a replacement part. You have to manufacture it yourself. Which means raw materials, and where exactly do you find raw materials floating through interstellar space? You can't. You either bring along everything you might conceivably need, or you recycle relentlessly. Every broken component gets stripped down to its base materials, which are then reformed into something new. Nothing gets wasted, everything gets reused. But recycling is never perfect. Each time a material passes through the cycle, a small amount is lost. Impurities creep in. Structural strength quietly degrades. After being recycled a dozen times over, a piece of metal might no longer hold up the way it once did, which becomes a serious problem when that metal is literally holding the ship together. You'd need something close to flawless recycling, a truly closed, loop manufacturing process with essentially zero loss. We don't have that technology today, not at the scale or efficiency a mission like this would demand. Maybe we will by the time such ships are actually built, but there's no guarantee. And if the recycling isn't perfect, the ship slowly bleeds away its own resources. Material quality declines. Replacement parts fall short of the originals. Systems grow less dependable. Failures become more frequent. And across centuries, all of this compounds. A ship 500 years into its voyage might be held together by inferior materials, patched with makeshift parts, functioning, but only just barely. One unexpected strain, one system pushed past its already weakened limits, and catastrophic failure follows. There's also a slower, subtler danger, the quiet decay of technical understanding itself. The ship launches carrying the very best technology of its time, and the original crew genuinely understands it. They were trained on Earth by the experts who built these systems. They grasp the underlying theory, can troubleshoot, adapt, innovate when something unexpected happens. Their children, though, don't have quite the same grounding. They learn from their parents, from manuals, from hands-on practice, solid training certainly, but not the same as belonging to the very civilization that invented the technology in the first place. Each generation stands one step further removed from that original well of knowledge, and with every step, something subtle slips away: intuition, nuance, the ability to think creatively beyond the instructions. By the 10th generation, the people maintaining the ship might simply be following procedures they don't fully understand at their core. They know that doing A leads to B, but they can't explain why from first principles. They can't improvise. And if something unexpected goes wrong, something the manuals never anticipated, they may find themselves genuinely stuck. This is a quiet, almost invisible danger. The ship might appear to be running perfectly, every system nominal, while the people responsible for it have slowly shifted from engineers into mere caretakers. They maintain, but they no longer truly innovate, and when an unprecedented crisis finally arrives, they may simply lack the depth of understanding to solve it. The mission wouldn't fail because the technology broke down. It would fail because the understanding needed to use that technology had quietly eroded away first. Some proposals suggest keeping an exhaustive digital archive aboard every technical manual, every research paper, every educational resource, stored redundantly across multiple systems, always accessible to future generations. But having access to information isn't the same thing as understanding it. You can read a manual on quantum mechanics from cover to cover without actually understanding quantum mechanics. Real understanding requires education, hands-on practice, mentorship, an entire intellectual lineage passed carefully from teacher to student. If that lineage ever breaks, the stored information becomes essentially useless, like stumbling upon an ancient library written in a language nobody left can read. The knowledge sits there, intact, but entirely out of reach. So preserving technical competence across generations demands far more than just preserving files. It demands preserving comprehension, and that is a far, far harder thing to sustain. Let's also think about staying in touch with Earth. For the first few decades, perhaps even the first century, the ship can maintain some form of communication with home. Messages take time to travel. Light itself takes years to cross the distance between ship and planet, but a connection remains possible. The ship sends updates, Earth replies with advice, encouragement, fresh discoveries. It's a thread back to home, a quiet reminder that Earth still exists, still remembers, still cares. But as the ship travels farther, that delay only grows. At 10 light-years out, a single message takes a decade to arrive, and a reply takes another decade to return 20 years for one full exchange. Slow, certainly, but still something. People aboard can still feel some thread of connection to humanity's home. Eventually, though, the delay stretches so long that meaningful conversation becomes essentially impossible. At 100 light-years, a full round trip stretches across 200 years, meaning whoever sent the original message will likely be long gone by the time any reply finally arrives. At that point, you're no longer really communicating with anyone. You're sending messages to people who haven't been born yet and receiving replies from people who died generations ago. It stops feeling like conversation and starts feeling more like reading historical records. Eventually, communication simply stops altogether. Maybe the ship has traveled too far. Maybe Earth stops sending word. Maybe the ship itself stops listening. Either way, the connection is severed for good, and the ship becomes truly and completely isolated, the only humans left in an empty stretch of void, with no link to Earth, no link to anyone beyond the few thousand people sharing the same walls. That is a profound thing to sit with psychologically. Human beings evolved as social creatures, wired to need connection to something larger than ourselves, the simple knowledge that even in a small town there are billions of other people out there, entire cities and nations and civilizations you're quietly part of. Aboard an isolated generation ship, humanity itself shrinks down to just the people around you, a few thousand individuals at most. As far as anyone aboard can ever know for certain, that is the entire human race. That kind of isolation can foster a narrow, closed-in mindset, a loss of wider perspective, an inability to imagine anything beyond the immediate. It can also breed a quiet despair, the knowledge that you are utterly alone in a universe that is vast, beautiful, and entirely indifferent to you. Some people cope by leaning fully into that smaller world, finding real meaning in the community aboard, focusing on the relationships and tasks right in front of them. Others struggle badly, feeling the crushing weight of everything beyond the ship, the absence pressing in on them. And when enough people feel that weight at once, morale simply collapses. There's also the chance of running into something unexpected mid-journey. Interstellar space isn't perfectly empty. There are rogue planets, worlds flung from their original star systems, drifting silently through the dark. There are clouds of gas and dust. There are cosmic rays, magnetic fields, gravitational quirks scattered here and there. Most of the voyage passes through relatively empty stretches, but every so often the ship might encounter something unplanned. Perhaps sensors detect a rogue planet years in advance, giving the crew time to adjust course and steer safely around it, no harm done. But what if detection comes too late? What if the sensors fail, or the object moves faster than predicted? A collision with a rogue planet would destroy the ship instantly, everyone gone in a fraction of a second, no warning, no chance to react, the mission simply over. That's the true nightmare scenario, and it isn't impossible. Space is dark, and rogue planets emit no light of their own. They're nearly invisible until you're already close. If the sensors aren't functioning flawlessly, if the crew isn't watching closely, a collision remains genuinely possible. There's also the quiet danger of interstellar gas clouds. Most are thin enough that the ship can pass through with barely any impact, but some are considerably denser. Passing through one at high velocity would feel something like flying through a sandstorm, particles striking the hull at relativistic speeds, each impact releasing tremendous energy. The ship's shielding might hold. It might not. If the cloud is dense enough, the accumulated damage could cripple or destroy the ship outright, and you can't easily dodge these clouds. They stretch across light years, and by the time you detect one, you may already be inside it. The only real option is to slow down, reducing speed to lessen the force of each impact. But slowing down stretches the journey out further, more decades, perhaps more centuries added to the trip, more generations spent in transit. More strain on resources, more strain on the social fabric holding everyone together. It's a genuinely terrible choice, risk destruction by holding your speed. Or accept a longer journey with every problem that entails. There's no clean answer here. Just careful risk management, calculating the odds, making the best call you can with the limited information available and hoping it turns out right. Now imagine the ship needs to make an emergency stop. Perhaps a vital system fails, the fusion reactor shuts down unexpectedly. Life support switches to emergency power. You have days, maybe a couple of weeks before oxygen runs out entirely. Stopping is necessary, so repairs can be made, but stopping in interstellar space is its own kind of problem. There's nowhere to actually stop. No safe harbor, no planet to set down on. You're billions of miles from the nearest star, and all you can really do is shut down the engines and drift, coming to a relative halt while the crew works desperately to fix whatever broke. But without main power, the ship becomes deeply vulnerable, life support strained, heat dwindling, temperatures dropping steadily. People huddle together in insulated sections, rationing power, rationing warmth, while a repair crew works around the clock, fully aware that every hour the reactor sits offline is another hour closer to disaster. They labor in near-freezing conditions, utterly exhausted, under crushing pressure, trying to fix a system that's centuries old, using parts that may not even be original and tools that might be improvised on the spot. If they succeed, the ship powers back up. Life support stabilizes. Warmth returns. The journey continues, but if they fail, everyone aboard is lost frozen, or suffocated once the oxygen finally runs dry. The ship becomes a silent tomb, drifting endlessly through the void. Perhaps millions of years from now it drifts into some distant star system. Perhaps some other intelligence, if one exists out there, eventually finds it a relic of a failed mission, a quiet monument to human ambition and tragedy alike. This is exactly why redundancy matters so much. You need backups for everything: multiple reactors, multiple life support units, layered redundancy throughout, so a single failure doesn't cascade into disaster. But redundancy adds mass, and mass demands more energy to move. There's always a trade-off: more safety costs more, less safety saves resources but raises risk. Engineers designing a real generation ship would have to navigate these trade-offs constantly, knowing that getting the balance wrong could prove catastrophic. Now picture a different outcome. The journey unfolds smoothly. No catastrophic failures. Social cohesion holds steady. The ship finally reaches its destination star system 800 years after leaving home. 30 generations have lived and passed in that time. Everyone currently aboard has known nothing but the ship itself. Earth exists only as ancient history, a place from old stories, nothing more tangible than that. Their whole sense of identity is wrapped up in the ship, the mission, the destination finally within reach. Excitement builds as the star grows brighter in the viewports. Sensors run detailed scans of the system, identifying the target planet, gathering spectroscopic readings of its atmosphere, surface temperature, magnetic field, gravity, and everything checks out. The planet appears habitable. Not identical to Earth, but close enough. Breathable air, liquid water, temperatures humans can tolerate. This is it, the destination that justified 800 years of sacrifice, finally within reach. But here's the complication. The people aboard have spent generations adapting to life in artificial gravity, generally weaker than Earth's own pull. Their bones have weakened, their muscles aren't as strong as they'd need to be. Their hearts and lungs aren't conditioned for full planetary gravity. Stepping onto the planet's surface is going to be a genuine physical struggle. Simply walking will be exhausting. Standing for any length of time will hurt. Some won't be able to adapt at all. Older individuals, people with existing health conditions, may need to stay aboard the ship permanently, while younger, healthier colonists make the descent. And those younger colonists face their own set of challenges. The planet's ecosystem is entirely alien. Its soil, air, and water carry microorganisms utterly unlike anything the colonists' immune systems have ever encountered. Illness is likely, sometimes severe allergic reactions, infections, diseases with no name yet. Some colonists will adjust over time as their immune systems catch up. Others won't, and some will suffer chronic illness, some will not survive the transition. It's a brutal filtering process, and the ones who don't make it are simply gone, shrinking the colony's genetic diversity further still. Then there's the question of whatever native life might already exist. If there's a real ecosystem down there, there might be predators too, creatures that see the newcomers as prey, or as competition for resources. Early colonists could be attacked, lost outright, and the colony would have only limited means of defense. Settling an unfamiliar planet isn't like stepping into a place already prepared for you. It's closer to walking into true wilderness, unpredictable and often hostile. You have to learn the rules the hard way, discovering what's safe and what's lethal through trial, error, and sometimes tragic loss. It's a slow, painful lesson. Meanwhile, the ship stays in orbit above, and some people simply refuse to leave it. They've spent their entire lives aboard. The ship is home, and the planet below feels alien, frightening, unknown. Why risk everything now? They'd rather stay, live out their days in the environment they already understand. But the ship was never designed to function indefinitely. It's degrading, systems failing, and it needs repairs and resources that only the planet below can provide. Staying aboard long-term simply isn't sustainable. Eventually the ship becomes uninhabitable, and everyone will have to leave. But convincing frightened people to leave before that point arrives is difficult, because fear is a powerful force, and it keeps people from taking necessary risks. So the population splits, part of it struggling to gain a foothold on the new world, part of it clinging to the familiar comfort of the ship. And slowly these two groups drift apart, developing different priorities, different identities. Those on the planet start to see themselves as pioneers, the true future. Those still aboard see themselves as preserving something built painstakingly over centuries. Tensions rise. The colonists need resources from the ship, equipment, supplies, people willing to join them. Those still aboard grow reluctant to hand any of it over, needing those same resources just to keep the ship functioning. Arguments follow, sometimes outright conflict, and the fledgling colony, barely established, begins to fracture even as it's being born. This is the true reality of arrival. It isn't triumphant, it's messy, difficult, layered with entirely new struggles. The end of the journey is really just the beginning of a different one, and there's no guarantee of success. Plenty of colonies could simply fail, the planet less habitable than believed, the colonists unable to adapt, disease claiming too many lives, the ecosystem simply too hostile. The colony collapses, and the ship, degraded and failing, has nowhere else to go and no way to leave. Everyone ends up trapped aboard a dying vessel, orbiting a world that ultimately rejected them, gone within a few more generations. The mission, after 800 years, fails right at the finish line. That's the nightmare scenario, and it isn't remotely implausible. Colonizing an alien world is extraordinarily difficult, even with the full backing of an established civilization behind you. Mars colonization, even with Earth support, would already be a monumental task. Now imagine attempting it with no support whatsoever, no resupply, no rescue, just a few thousand people and whatever they manage to carry with them. The odds simply aren't good. But suppose, against everything stacked against them, the colony survives. People adapt. The planet slowly becomes home. Children are born on solid ground, growing up beneath an open sky. They've never known any other way to them. This is simply normal. The planet is home. The ship becomes little more than a relic, an artifact from a bygone era, and eventually it's abandoned entirely, stripped of anything useful, left drifting empty in orbit, a quiet monument to the journey that brought them there. And the colony keeps growing. Generations pass, new settlements spread outward. A whole civilization slowly takes shape, shaped by this strange new world, and by the hardships of both the voyage and the settlement that followed. They remember Earth only through old stories and archived records. It isn't home to them anymore. This is home, and genetically, culturally, psychologically, they are no longer quite the same as the people who once lived on Earth. They've become something new, a distinct branch of humanity, shaped by an unfamiliar world. This is the long-term outcome. If a generation ship truly succeeds, not simply an extension of Earth's civilization carried elsewhere, but the emergence of something genuinely new, something that carries humanity's legacy forward while also becoming entirely its own thing. Perhaps thousands of years from now, this new colony builds ships of its own, sends its own explorers toward other stars, and the whole process begins again, humanity, or what humanity has become, spreading slowly across the galaxy, one painful, centuries-long journey at a time. It's a vision that stirs something in people, the idea of a species no longer confined to a single world, spreading life and awareness across the cosmos, ensuring that even if one world is lost, others continue on, that the legacy endures regardless. But it's also a vision that demands enormous sacrifice, generations of people born, living, and passing away in transit, never witnessing the destination, never receiving recognition for their part in it, simply fulfilling their role in a chain spanning centuries. Is that noble, or is it tragic? Perhaps, quietly, it's both at once. There's another possibility worth sitting with, one that carries its own quiet dread. What if, sometime during the voyage, humanity back on Earth develops faster than light travel or some other technological leap entirely? What if, centuries after the generation ship departs, Earth launches a newer, faster vessel that overtakes it and reaches the destination first? The generation ship would arrive to find a colony already flourishing there, their entire purpose, the sacrifice of dozens of generations, suddenly rendered meaningless. They wouldn't be pioneers anymore. They'd simply be relics, outdated before they'd even arrived. This scenario has certainly shown up in science fiction, but it rests on a genuinely real concern technology moves forward. What takes 1,000 years with today's methods might take 100 years with tomorrow's, or 10, or 1. The people aboard the generation ship wouldn't know in real time. Communication with Earth would remain possible, but constrained by the speed of light messages take years to arrive, and by the time one does, it's already out of date. You might learn that Earth has developed superior propulsion, but by then it's far too late to change course. You're already committed to your own journey, with no way to turn back. You'd simply have to hope you still matter by the time you finally arrive. And there's an even darker possibility tucked inside this one. What if Earth simply forgets about you? The mission would launch with tremendous fanfare, humanity's first true attempt to reach another star. But decades pass, and the excitement inevitably fades. New priorities take hold. Earth faces its own struggles: climate change, political upheaval, resource scarcity. The generation ship slowly becomes a historical footnote, a mission from some distant, half-forgotten era. People stop thinking about it, stop discussing it, and eventually it fades from memory entirely. Then you arrive at your destination, expecting some kind of acknowledgement, some renewed connection to humanity's original home, and there's nothing. No messages, no follow-up missions. Earth has simply moved on without you. You're alone, truly alone, the last living remnant of a mission the rest of humanity forgot. That kind of isolation could be genuinely devastating. Realizing that no one remembers you, that no one out there is thinking of you at all, carries a profound psychological weight. Depression, a creeping sense of meaninglessness, a collapse of purpose. Why continue? Why bother settling this world at all? And for whom? These are exactly the kinds of thoughts capable of quietly breaking a society apart. Now let's sit with something even more unsettling: the possibility that the mission should never have launched at all. Suppose the star system chosen as the destination was selected using the very best available data at the time of departure. Telescopes observed the star, detected orbiting planets, studied their atmospheres through spectroscopy, and everything pointed toward habitability. But that data has real limits. You simply can't examine a planet in fine detail from light years away. You make your best educated guess, and sometimes those guesses turn out wrong. The ship arrives only to discover that the supposedly habitable planet bears no resemblance to what was expected: too hot, too cold, a toxic atmosphere, no water, entirely uninhabitable. The whole mission was built on a mistake. Centuries of travel, generations of sacrifice, all for nothing. What do you do then? You can't return to Earth. The ship simply lacks the fuel or resources for a reverse journey. You can't travel onward to another star system either. You're stuck, adrift in an interstellar void with nowhere left to go. The only remaining option is to try surviving in space indefinitely, living aboard the ship forever. But the ship was never built for that. It was designed with an endpoint in mind. Systems continue degrading, resources remain finite. Without a planetary base to draw from, the ship will eventually fail, and everyone aboard will be lost along with it. This is the true nightmare scenario, the mission failing not through human error, not through any breakdown in society, but simply because the foundational premise was wrong from the very start, and nobody realized it until it was already too late to matter. Could this genuinely happen? Absolutely. Our current understanding of exoplanets remains limited. We can detect them, estimate their size, their orbital distance, sometimes even their atmospheric makeup, but we can't see their actual surfaces, can't study their geology or their weather patterns in any real detail. We're working from inference, and inferences can simply be wrong. A planet that looks perfectly habitable from 4 light years away could turn out to be an absolute hellscape up close, and there's no way to know for certain until you actually arrive. Sending a generation ship means betting centuries of human lives on those inferences holding true. That's a genuinely terrifying gamble to take. There's also the matter of genetic drift and mutation to consider. Across hundreds of years, the population aboard will inevitably evolve. Mutations will arise, some harmless, some beneficial, some genuinely damaging. In a small population, harmful mutations spread more easily simply because there isn't enough genetic diversity to dilute them. You could see rising rates of genetic disorders, inherited disease, reduced fertility over time, something known as inbreeding depression, well documented in small, isolated populations. Island species often display it. Royal families that practiced generations of intermarriage experienced it too higher rates of genetic illness, shorter lifespans, diminished overall fitness. A generation ship is in essence an isolated population much like these. Without active management, genetic health will simply decline over time. You'd need ongoing genetic oversight, screening embryos for harmful mutations, actively selecting for diversity, perhaps even using genetic engineering to correct emerging problems. But genetic engineering carries its own baggage, ethical objections, social resistance. Not everyone aboard would necessarily agree that modifying human genetics is acceptable, and factions might form in opposition, grounded in moral or religious conviction. If those factions gained real influence, they might ban the very practices needed to preserve genetic health, leading to a slow generational decline, fewer healthy births, rising infant mortality, shortening lifespans. the population steadily dwindling until it eventually drops below the minimum needed to sustain the mission at all. Radiation exposure represents another slow-building concern. Even behind shielding, some radiation inevitably gets through, and over decades, cumulative exposure raises cancer risk and damages DNA, producing mutations that pass down to the next generation. Across centuries, that accumulated genetic damage could become significant higher rates of cancer, birth defects, neurological disorders. The population's overall health would slowly deteriorate. Medical resources would be stretched thinner, quality of life would decline, and people would simply suffer, with no way to escape it. You can't leave the ship, and you can't meaningfully reduce radiation exposure beyond whatever the shielding already provides. You simply endure it, generation after generation, watching your own health and your children's health slowly erode, knowing full well it will only worsen with time. That's a genuine psychological burden layered right on top of the physical one. Let's turn to the economics behind all of this. Building a generation ship would be staggeringly expensive. We're talking about a structure miles long, fully equipped with life support for thousands of people, propulsion systems, power generation, manufacturing capability, all engineered to hold up for centuries. The price tag would run into the trillions, possibly tens of trillions, more than the entire GDP of most nations combined. So who actually pays for it? Governments? Private corporations? Some consortium of nations pooling their resources together? And who decides where the ship travels, or who gets a seat aboard it? These are political questions every bit as much as engineering ones, and they don't come with easy answers. You'd need international cooperation on a scale humanity has genuinely never managed before. Nations that can barely agree on climate policy somehow finding consensus on funding and crewing a mission that won't bear any fruit for centuries. Why would any government pour resources into something that offers absolutely no benefit to the people currently living there? Whoever funds the mission will be long gone before it ever arrives. There's no political payoff, no votes to win, no economic return of any kind. It's purely an investment in a future none of the investors will ever witness. And human beings, especially the politicians among us, are notoriously poor at thinking on those kinds of timescales. We already struggle to plan decades ahead. A mission spanning centuries seems almost impossibly distant by comparison. Securing the political will and financial backing for something like this seems nearly impossible, unless perhaps some genuine crisis forces humanity's hand. Maybe Earth becomes uninhabitable, somehow climate change spiraling out of control, an asteroid impact looming, a devastating nuclear conflict. In a moment of true crisis, people might rally behind a generation ship as a kind of insurance policy, a way to guarantee humanity's survival even if Earth itself is lost. But even under crisis conditions, building a ship of this magnitude takes real time, decades at minimum, likely centuries. By the time it's finally ready to launch, the original crisis might already have passed, or, just as easily, it might have already claimed everyone. Timing matters enormously here, and we have essentially no control over when a crisis actually strikes. There's also the delicate matter of who actually gets to board. If you're building a ship for 1,000 people, and billions of others would love the chance to leave Earth behind, how do you possibly choose? A lottery? Merit-based selection? Wealth? Political connections? Whatever process you settle on will be deeply controversial. People will argue it's unfair that the wrong individuals were chosen, that the criteria themselves were biased, and they might well be right. How do you fairly select 1,000 people to somehow represent all of humanity? You simply can't. Any selection process excludes the overwhelming majority, and those left behind will understandably resent it. Some might try to sabotage the mission outright, or demand the crew be reconsidered, or organize protests that delay the launch indefinitely. In many ways, the social and political hurdles involved in actually launching a generation ship might prove even harder to clear than the engineering ones. Now let's step back into the perspective of a single person living this out. Say you're born 30 years into the journey. Your parents were part of the original crew they chose, consciously, to board the ship. Fully understanding they would never see Earth again, they accepted that sacrifice willingly. But you didn't choose anything. You were simply born into it. You grow up hearing stories about earth-green forests, blue oceans, open skies, places you will never once set foot on. You've seen recordings, simulations, virtual reality recreations, but none of it is quite the same as being there. You know, on some intellectual level, that Earth genuinely exists, but emotionally it feels more like a myth than a real place, a story from long ago. Your world is the ship itself. Metal corridors, hydroponic gardens, the steady hum of life support running in the background. This is your entire reality, and you already know you'll never leave it. You'll live here for 70 years, perhaps 80, likely working in agriculture or engineering or medicine. You'll build relationships, maybe start a family of your own. Your children will spend their entire lives here too. And eventually, you'll be gone, and they'll carry the journey forward. Their children will continue it further still, and maybe, centuries from now, your own distant descendants will finally reach the destination, but you won't. How do you find genuine meaning in a life shaped like that? How do you wake each morning and go about your work, knowing your entire existence is just one small link in a chain stretching across a journey you'll never see completed? Some people manage to find real meaning in simply being part of something larger than themselves. They take genuine pride in their role, understanding that without their contribution, the whole mission falters. That sense of being essential gives them purpose. Others struggle far more. They feel trapped, resentful of being born into a mission they never had any say in, wishing desperately they'd had some choice in the matter. But there is no choice. You can't leave the ship. There's nowhere to go. You're billions of miles from the nearest planet, and even if you desperately wanted to leave, you simply couldn't. You're bound to this life for good. And that realization, the complete absence of agency, the total lack of freedom to choose your own path, can be genuinely crushing. It can spiral into depression, apathy, quiet resentment, and those feelings tend to spread outward, one person's despair touching everyone nearby. Morale slips. Productivity falls, social bonds weaken, and the mission itself becomes that much harder to sustain. This is exactly why mental health support matters so profoundly aboard a generation ship. You'd need psychologists, counselors, real support networks in place. You'd need cultural traditions specifically designed to help people cope with confinement and a lack of personal agency, rituals, celebrations, anything that gives life meaning beyond bare survival. But even with the very best support systems imaginable, some people will still struggle deeply, and in a population of only 1,000 or so, even a modest percentage struggling represents real weight on the whole community. 10% of the population wrestling with serious depression, for instance, is 100 people not fully able to contribute. 100 who may need extra care and support, 100 who might make poor choices under the strain. That's an ongoing burden the entire community carries together, generation after generation, since mental health challenges can never truly be eliminated, only managed, with the hope that the support systems in place hold steady across centuries. Let's think about the information gap too. A generation ship travels through interstellar space for hundreds of years, all the while receiving updates from both Earth and the eventual destination system, but that information always arrives years out of date, delayed by the simple speed of light. A message sent from Earth takes years just to reach the ship. And by the time it does, whatever it describes may have already changed. Earth might have developed entirely new technology, learned fresh details about the destination, even launched newer, faster ships altogether, and the generation ship simply wouldn't know in real time. It only ever learns years after the fact. That creates genuine strategic uncertainty. Should the ship adjust its course based on new information? Slow down, speed up, change destinations entirely? Every decision gets made using data that's already outdated, flying somewhat blind, trusting information that might no longer even be accurate. And there's no way around that limitation. You can't communicate faster than light. You simply have to accept that you're always working from old information and hope it remains close enough to true by the time you actually arrive. There's also the slow creep of technological obsolescence to consider. The ship launches carrying the very best technology available at the time, but technology keeps advancing regardless. By the time the ship reaches its halfway point, Earth might have developed vastly superior systems, better life support, more efficient propulsion, advanced medicine the ship simply doesn't have access to. But the ship can't upgrade. It's traveling through space with no way to receive new equipment or supplies. It's stuck with whatever it launched carrying, and as that technology ages and falls further behind, the gap only widens. The people aboard know this. 2 messages from Earth describe breakthroughs and capabilities the ship simply can't access. And it becomes clear that their entire mission runs on technology that's already outdated. That a mission launched today would be faster, safer, better equipped in every way. But they're stuck with what they have. That knowledge alone can be quietly demoralizing, reinforcing a sense of being left behind, of being obsolete before your own journey even ends. It raises real questions too. Could Earth somehow send supplies along the way? In theory, perhaps, if faster propulsion is eventually developed and a resupply mission could catch up with the generation ship to deliver upgrades. But in practice, this proves enormously complicated. Matching velocity with a ship moving at a meaningful fraction of light speed is genuinely difficult. Transferring cargo across interstellar distances carries real risk. And by the time Earth develops the capability to even attempt such a mission, the generation ship might already be so far away that the effort simply isn't worthwhile. So, realistically, the ship is likely on its own indefinitely, relying on technology that grows more outdated with every passing year. Now let's consider how culture itself would evolve aboard the ship. It launches carrying culture imported directly from Earth, the original crew's language, values, traditions, beliefs, but culture is never static. It shifts across generations, and the culture aboard the ship will inevitably change too. Language will drift, new words emerging, old words shifting meaning until, eventually, the language spoken aboard might barely resemble what was originally spoken back on Earth. Values will shift as well. What the original crew held dear might look entirely different to their descendants generations later. Traditions will change, two new customs emerging naturally from life aboard the ship. Old ones fading or transforming into something else. 500 years in, the culture aboard will likely be something wholly distinct from Earth's own. The people living there won't think of themselves as humans from Earth. At all, they'll think of themselves simply as ship people. An entirely separate identity. And that identity might carry no particular loyalty toward Earth, or toward the mission's original purpose. They might develop entirely new priorities, entirely new goals, and those goals might directly conflict with the mission itself. This is cultural drift, and it's essentially unavoidable. You can try preserving Earth's original culture through education, recordings, careful ritual, but you cannot fully halt change itself. Culture evolves regardless, and after enough generations, whatever culture exists aboard the ship will be something genuinely new. Something that may not value the mission the way its original founders once did. Which raises an honest question if the people aboard no longer identify with Earth at all. If they've developed their own distinct culture entirely, do they still owe any obligation to complete the mission? Or are they free to choose their own path instead? It's a philosophical question, certainly, but one with very real, practical consequences. If some future generation decides to abandon the mission altogether, to stop traveling toward the original destination, settle somewhere else, or simply drift indefinitely, what happens then? The mission fails outright, centuries of collective effort essentially wasted. But from their own perspective, they're simply exercising agency, choosing their own future rather than remaining bound by decisions made long ago by ancestors they never actually knew. Who's right in that scenario? There's genuinely no clear answer. It depends entirely on what you value. And that's precisely what makes generation ships so troubling as an idea. You're asking people to commit to something spanning centuries, and yet people change, cultures change, and there's simply no guarantee that future generations will ever share the same values and priorities the very first generation started with. Now let's think through the math behind simple survival. For a generation ship to succeed at all, it has to maintain a viable population across the entire journey, meaning birth rates need to match, or slightly exceed, the rate at which people pass away. If more people are lost each year than are born, the population begins shrinking, and eventually it drops below whatever threshold is needed to sustain the mission at all. But holding stable population growth inside a closed system is genuinely tricky. Resources are limited, you can't support endless growth, but you also can't tolerate ongoing decline. You need to hit a very narrow target, enough berths to offset losses, but not so many that you exceed the ship's carrying capacity. And you need to maintain that delicate balance for centuries straight. Any small deviation compounds over time. A modest drop in birth rate, just a few percentage points, can compound generation after generation until, 200 years later, the population has fallen by half, taking with it genetic diversity and skilled labor that could prove genuinely catastrophic to lose. On the flip side, a small rise in birth rate leads just as easily to overcrowding. Strained resources, food shortages, and social conflict. The ship grows overcrowded. Quality of life declines, and people suffer regardless. You need precise, ongoing control over population growth, sustained faithfully by every single generation. One generation that drops the ball, allowing growth too fast or decline too steep, can doom the entire mission. That's an enormous responsibility, one that never really lets up, with essentially zero room for error. Now picture the final approach to the destination. The ship has been traveling for a full 1,000 years. 40 generations have lived and passed in that time, and finally, the target star system comes into view. Onboard telescopes can resolve the planets in real detail. One of them looks genuinely promising, the right size, the right distance from its star. Spectroscopy reveals oxygen in its atmosphere. It might just be habitable. Excitement builds throughout the ship. For the first time in living memory, there's real hope. The journey is nearly over. But fear rises too. What if it isn't what everyone hoped? What if the planet turns out uninhabitable after all, or some unforeseen danger awaits? The ship begins its deceleration, a critical, delicate phase. After centuries of acceleration building up to a meaningful fraction of light speed, it now has to slow itself down, which demands enormous energy. You can't simply hit the brakes. Engines have to fire in the opposite direction, burning fuel, generating thrust, and this process takes real time, decades, perhaps close to a century. The ship must begin slowing well before it actually reaches the star system, or risk overshooting the destination entirely, flying past at speed with no way to stop. And during deceleration, stress on the ship climbs sharply. Structural strain from braking thrust, heat from engines running continuously, wear on systems already centuries old. This is exactly when failures become most likely. If a critical system fails during deceleration, the ship might not slow down properly at all, missing the destination outright. Or worse, arriving too fast and crashing into the planet because it couldn't brake in time. After 1,000 years of travel, the mission could still fail in its very final stretch, arguably the cruelest possible outcome, to come so impossibly close only to fail right at the end. But suppose deceleration succeeds. The ship settles into orbit around the destination planet. Sensors scan the surface in detail, data streaming in continuously. Is it truly habitable? Can humans actually survive down there? That single answer determines everything that follows. If the answer is yes, preparations for colonization begin. Landers prepped, supplies loaded, colonists chosen. The first group descends to the surface, steps out, and breathes the air for the first time. If they survive, more follow, and a colony slowly takes root. The mission succeeds. But if the planet turns out uninhabitable after all, if the data was simply wrong, or conditions shifted since the original observations, the mission has failed, and there's nowhere else left to go. This is the genuinely terrifying truth underlying generation ships. You're committing to a journey spanning centuries, staking everything on a destination you've never actually seen. Trusting that your information holds true, that the ship survives intact, that the people aboard maintain their cohesion, that nothing catastrophic ever intervenes. It's an enormous gamble, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Thousands of human lives, entire generations born, living, and passing away in transit, all in the hope of reaching a new world. A hope that might never actually be realized. And yet, despite every challenge we've walked through tonight, some scientists and futurists still genuinely advocate for generation ships. They argue it may be the only realistic way to spread humanity beyond our solar system, that the risks, however enormous, are worth accepting. Because the alternative is remaining confined to Earth and its immediate neighborhood indefinitely, vulnerable to extinction from asteroid strikes, supervolcanic eruptions, pandemics, nuclear conflict, runaway climate change. A generation ship, flaws and all, represents a kind of backup plan, a way to ensure at least some portion of humanity survives, even if Earth itself doesn't. From that vantage point, the suffering and sacrifice endured aboard might feel genuinely justified, a way of securing the species' continuation. That's a noble goal, certainly, but it's also fundamentally a utilitarian argument, one that prioritizes species survival above individual well-being, asking people to sacrifice their entire lives, and their children's lives too, for the sake of distant descendants they'll never actually meet. Not everyone agrees that's an acceptable trade. Some argue it's fundamentally unethical to impose that burden on people who never consented to it in the first place. The original crew chose to board freely. Their children never made that choice. Neither did their grandchildren. You'd be creating entire generations whose lives are defined from birth by a mission they never agreed to. Is that fair? Is it moral? These are genuinely difficult questions without easy answers, touching on deep issues of autonomy, consent, and whether individual lives should ever be weighed against collective goals. Different people will land on very different conclusions, but they're questions worth sitting with seriously if we're truly considering generation ships at all. Because building the ship itself is genuinely the easy part. Justifying what we're asking people to endure is the far harder challenge. In recent years, some have proposed alternatives entirely. Suspended animation or cryogenic freezing would place the crew into stasis for the entire journey. They wouldn't age, wouldn't consume resources, wouldn't experience the psychological toll of generational confinement. They'd simply fall asleep on Earth and wake up at the destination, the journey feeling, from their perspective, essentially instantaneous. This would resolve many of the problems we've discussed tonight. No need for generations to live and pass aboard, no governance crises, no cultural drift, just a single crew that launches and arrives intact. But cryogenic freezing carries its own serious challenges. We simply don't yet have the technology to freeze and revive a human being without causing real damage. Ice crystals forming inside cells, rupturing them. Metabolic processes that can't simply be paused and restarted on command. There are genuine biological barriers we haven't overcome yet. Perhaps we will one day research into cryopreservation continues, but there's no guarantee, and even if the technology matures, it carries real risk. What if the revival process itself fails? What if people wake up with brain damage, memory loss, physical impairment? What if the systems maintaining stasis fail somewhere along the journey, leaving everyone frozen in their pods, unable to wake and unable to fix whatever broke? At least aboard a conventional generation ship, there are conscious people capable of responding to emergencies as they happen. With everyone in stasis, the ship runs entirely on autopilot, and if something goes wrong, there's simply no one awake to fix it. Another alternative altogether involves sending robotic probes instead of people. Robots need no life support. They don't grow lonely or depressed. They can function for decades, even centuries, with minimal upkeep. You could send a fleet ahead to a distant star system, have them construct infrastructure, prepare the environment in advance, and only then send humans on a much shorter, far safer trip. Or perhaps skip sending humans, entirely let the robots serve as our representatives, exploring, gathering data, transmitting it home, so humanity learns about distant worlds without risking a single human life. This approach is genuinely appealing, in many ways safer, cheaper, ethically far simpler. But it's also, in some sense, less human. There's something about people physically travelling to distant worlds, setting foot on truly alien ground, that captures the imagination in a way machines simply can't replicate. We want to explore ourselves, not merely send machines to explore in our place. There's a deep-seated desire to expand, to spread outward, to witness new worlds with our own eyes, and robots, however capable, cannot fulfill that particular longing. So despite every challenge, despite the genuinely unsettling reality of what a generation ship would actually demand of the people aboard, the idea persists, because it speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit, the drive to explore, to push past known limits, to reach for something beyond what currently seems possible, even when the cost is immense, even when the sacrifice asked of us feels almost unimaginable. So where does that leave us? Generation ships are, at least theoretically, possible. We understand the physics well enough. We grasp the engineering, at least in broad principle. Given enough resources and sustained effort, we could, in theory, actually build one. But should we? That's the real question, and it doesn't come with a clean answer. If you value the survival of our species above all else, if you believe spreading humanity to the stars is essential to our long-term future, then a generation ship might well be justified, the suffering endured aboard tragic, certainly, but perhaps a price worth paying to ensure humanity continues. If instead you place greater weight on individual autonomy and well-being, if you believe no one should be born into a mission they never chose, then generation ships start to look deeply ethically troubling. Perhaps we should wait instead for better technology, for alternatives that don't demand this kind of sacrifice. Both perspectives hold real merit. Both are entirely valid ways of looking at this. And that tension is exactly what makes the whole question so difficult to resolve. There's no obvious right answer here, only trade-offs, costs weighed against benefits, risks weighed against potential rewards, and the stakes involved are about as high as they could possibly be. the future of humanity itself, the survival of our species, the possibility of life someday spreading beyond Earth to the stars, all set against the lives and well-being of thousands of people who would be asked to endure centuries of confinement, isolation, and quiet sacrifice. It's a heavy weight to carry, and it's a decision humanity might genuinely have to make someday. Perhaps not in our lifetimes, perhaps not for centuries yet. But eventually, if we survive long enough as a species, this choice will land in front of us. Do we build these ships and send people toward the stars, or do we accept our limits and remain close to home? What would you choose? Would you board a generation ship, knowing full well you'd never see the destination yourself? Would you accept that your children, too, would live their entire lives aboard, simply hoping that their own descendants might one day walk beneath a new sky? Or would you decline, valuing your freedom and theirs over the mission itself? These aren't easy questions. And they don't come with easy answers, but they're worth sitting with quietly, because they reveal something genuinely profound about who we are and what we value. They force us to weigh individual desire against collective purpose, the immediate against the distant future, the comfort of what's known against the pull of the unknown. Generation ships, in a way, act almost like a mirror reflecting our ambitions, our fears, our willingness to sacrifice, our need for meaning and purpose. They show us humanity at both its best and its most, troubling the courage to attempt something nearly impossible, alongside the difficulty of asking others to carry the weight of that attempt. The dream of finally reaching the stars, set against the sheer difficulty of what actually getting there would require. So yes, generation ships are, quietly, a little terrifying. Not really because of the engineering challenges, though those are entirely real. Not because of the sheer distances involved, though those are humbling too. But because of what they would truly ask of us. They ask us to commit to something we will never see finished ourselves, to sacrifice our own lives and the lives of generations of our descendants in pursuit of a goal that might never even be achieved, to live in confinement, isolation, and uncertainty for centuries on end, trusting the whole time that it's genuinely worth it. That's the quiet, terrifying truth at the heart of generation ships. They're possible. We could build them. But the true cost isn't measured in dollars or resources at all. It's measured in human lives, in generations of people who would be born, live, and pass away in the darkness between the stars. And that cost might simply be too high to pay. Or it might be exactly the price we eventually have to accept if we want to survive, to spread outward, to become a species no longer confined to one fragile planet circling one ordinary star. Only time, in the end, will tell. But the question remains gently with us. Would you go? Would you board a generation ship, knowing everything we've talked through tonight, the risks, the suffering, the uncertainty stretching out ahead? Or would you stay behind instead, watching others take that journey, quietly wondering what might have been? It's a question worth sitting with, because someday someone truly may have to answer it. And whatever answer they land on will determine whether humanity remains bound to a single world or becomes something more, something that reaches across the stars, whatever the cost turns out to be. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight. If this exploration gave you something to think about, a like or a subscribe helps this channel keep exploring these deep questions about humanity's future among the stars. And remember, the universe out there is vast and beautiful and, yes, a little daunting too. We're only just beginning to understand what it would truly take to explore it properly. Sleep well tonight, knowing the stars are still out there, quietly waiting. Whether we'll ever actually reach them remains to be seen. But the simple fact that we can imagine it, that we can plan for it, that we're even willing to wrestle with the sheer weight of what it demands, says something remarkable about who we are. We dream of the impossible. And sometimes, quietly, patiently, we find a way to make it real, even when the reality itself turns out to be daunting.